To give a quick insight into the idea of Jews in New England and those that were early comers and medium comers and late comers, a very good example would be my father, Harry Winebaum, who, as an immigrant, came to Lawrence, Mass. With 3 brothers eventually and 3 sisters. This was in something like 1906. As far as the sisters were concerned, and my father too, they worked in the Lawrence mills as sisters, I guess, were through school, high school. My father, I know he wasn't. The sisters were rabid communists, I believe, even though when I did their oral history many years later, the one that still lived denied it and said to no, they were just people working. But they certainly were on the ramparts in the famous 1916 Lawrence strike. And that social consciousness has held strong, but it evolved tremendously over the years. On my father's part, he was a young boy who got to school often, but not all the time. One of the jobs he had at the mill was to climb up on the great wheels that were hot metal and oil them. More important job, though, was as head of the Lawrence Newsboys Association, some 60 or so young boys who delivered papers for Hearst, the Boston Advertiser and the Boston Herald. At one point, about 1916, 16, I guess, the boys decided to strike against the Hearst papers, and they refused to deliver. And after some weeks, certain couple of thugs came into Lawrence, and they rounded up certain of these boys, and they, as far as my father's concerned, they broke his nose and I think broke his arm, and the boys continued the strike. And after some 6 months, they won. Whatever they won for, I have no idea, because paper was maybe 2 cents, so maybe they won a mill more or something, but they won. And a few days after the strike, word was given to my father that I think a Mr. McGurk, who was the head of the circulation in Boston for the Lawrence papers, wanted him to come to Boston to see him. My father got to Boston, and he told me while he was waiting in the lobby, he saw the 2 thugs that had beat him up. And he said, I'm sure that they are going to take me into a room and they're going to kill me now. But however, Mr. McGurk asked my father in, and after a little while he said, something like, Harry, we like your style. Would you be our agent in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, representing the Hearst papers? My father hadn't quite finished high school, and my father asked when he wanted him to be there, and he said in 3 days. So my father got $10 from his mother. He found a way by switching trains to get from Lawrence to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He stayed in a hotel called a Kearsarge, still in Portsmouth, and he spent $2.50 for a bed, which, as you all know, all the Jewish houses had roomers, and for $2.50 you could live in a place for a week and have meals. That anybody would charge $2.50 for a bed was beyond his comprehension. He told me years later that he was so furious that they had taken half of the money he had left that he said, in order to get even, I left the lights on all night long in my room. At any rate, the next morning he got up and went to the depot, and the train from Boston came in with the Hearst papers, and he started a company in that way, which lasted some 77 years. Now, as a young man in Portsmouth, he got to be known by the power elite, which was the various judges in Portsmouth. And for example, after a couple of years, he knew a Judge Guptill, one of the power elite in Portsmouth, who said to him, Harry, it's time for you to register to vote. And my father said, yes, I know. And Judge Guptill said to him, Harry, you must register to vote, and you must register as a Republican. He said, I don't give a damn how you ever vote, but make sure your name is on the list as a Republican, which my father did, and he never, I don't believe, ever voted Republican, but he was to his death a registered Republican. Portsmouth was at one time a very fancy town. President Adams said that they had tremendous pretensions. They had great furniture, great houses, and a lot of wealth that came from the piracy of the British and French ships at various times. And they were very tough cookies. My father, very early on, by his personality, was the first person of Jewish faith truly to bridge those two worlds. For example, in the 1930s, the Portsmouth Country Club decided to have what they called a Twilight League. It was the first in the United States. It was a league that played golf on Thursday afternoons, and my father was the first Jewish man. The league started, and he was one of the original people, but he was the only Jewish person in that. They started more or less the same time, the Kiwanis in Portsmouth, and he and another guy, Al Wilson, were the first Jewish people in that world. He was the president of the synagogue in Portsmouth for some 20 years.
This is Temple Israel?
Yeah. Temple Israel. In other words, to just get the facts out, here was a man who was as Jewish as they could be, but proved at a time when it was truly unique that it was utterly possible to keep your Jewish identity and still live in both worlds. When they had World War II, he was in charge of the ration board. He was on the Portsmouth Hospital board for years. he ran for and was on the city council for 2 terms. In other words, there was an intellectual elite in Portsmouth, and there was also a shipyard elite, guys who worked in the shipyard, whose fathers worked in the shipyard, and my father was able to bridge both worlds. He had a business that the selling of newspapers and magazines and books, and many of the poorer kids in Portsmouth worked for him as newsboys. Many have come up to me over the years, and this is an indication of the way it can be done. People bemoan the fact that they're separate, or people celebrate the fact that they're separate as Jews. I think both those circumstances are a function of competence. For example, every Christmas, my father would give all the newsboys that worked for him a silver dollar. And he would say, hold on to this dollar, never spend it, you'll never be broke. And he would take out a silver dollar out of his pocket, which was so completely worn down that it was like a quarter. And years later, when we had a 75th anniversary of our company, I asked and got a hold of a bunch of the old newsboys, 6 or 7 that were still alive, and they came to a little dinner we had, and 4 of them showed me silver dollars that they still had. One had made it into a belt, another guy had it in his wallet, another guy who was Chinese had it in his pocket. It was about the same as my father's quarter, worn completely down. So he never, ever, he knew exactly what he was doing, in the sense that he would say to me, after he had jollied somebody up, say a Christian, could be a Jew, he would then make it very clear to me what he really had in mind and what he really thought of that person, just to give me insight into the real world, how things go. And, he was an absolute miracle. When the fanciest thing, when Strawberry Bank was to start, before it started, the Blue Bloods in Portsmouth came to him and said, Harry, the famous Chase House in Portsmouth, which is part of Strawberry Bank now, is coming up for sale, and we don't have any money, but we're going to have money someday. Would you buy the house for us? And this was the historic preservation. This was the colonial revival. This was all the Mayflower people. Of course, he bought the house, and after a couple of years, he sold the mortgage to them. However, there wouldn't have been a Strawberry Bank because urban renewal was going through, and the idea was that Strawberry Bank would be low-income housing. There were all kinds of dumps and junkyards owned by Jews and other things. My grandfather was a junkie, and in the 1940s, this whole area was going to be made into urban renewal housing, and a woman named Vaughn, librarian, and my father, and a historic preservation guy, went down to Washington, D.C., and they went to Styles Bridges' office. He was the minority whip of the Senate from New Hampshire. Very, very conservative. I mean, rabid. He was Lowe's, the publisher of the Manchester Union's absolute pal. I mean, they couldn't have been more right-wing. And my father and Miss Fawn and Ronald, I'd forgotten. Anyway, they went down and they made their case to Bridges that it should be a historic preservation rather than a housing. And the senator said, gosh, that makes good sense. I want that to happen. Whereupon the aide to the senator said, Senator, you can't do that. The law says this is a Title 8 or whatever it is, and it has to be urban renewal. The money's been put forth. You can't change the law. Whereupon Bridges said, these people have made a very good case, number one. Number two, I'm the minority whip. Number three, I'm from a small state. I get practically nothing compared to other states. I want this to happen. Make it happen. And it did happen. It was the only time when they had ever changed urban renewal to historic preservation. But the reason I tell the story is, again and again, there he was, not as a Jewish guy, but as a human being that had desire to make something happen. He never in a million years ever thought that the Shapiro house would be anything. I mean, they had left it, his brother had left it years before, and as a matter of fact, he did some deals in real estate with Abraham Shapiro. But I go through all of this to give you maybe not the reasons, but insights into how it can happen that you can keep your utter Jewish identity present in the synagogue for 20 years. The best fundraiser for the synagogue. And when they built a whole new addition, he raised the money. At the same time, he saw to it that his brother, one of those fellows from Lawrence who went to MIT, was the architect for the new part of the synagogue. So what I'm saying is that you really want to know how Jewish people relate in the Christian society, and I thought one of the best ways I could help you with that was to show you by anecdote and example the way in which one guy did it. Okay?
Yeah.
Stop the thing.
I have a question that relates to your dad and his generation first, and that is, I know in the big picture why so many people came here around that period of time, but I wonder what you know in particular about in his case, why did in this case to Lawrence, why did he come to the States in the first place? What was the old country for him?
Is it song?
Yeah.
Yeah, the old country was the Pale, and I'm not as clear about the immigration of my father because I never met. My grandfather on his side was dead by the time. No, I'm sorry, my other grandfather was dead, but they. I'm not sure how they came. Whether it's through Canada, I just don't know. I do know that in Portsmouth and in Lawrence too, there always was, in Portsmouth there was a a man named, family named Gauss, Gaugouse, and they had a farm outside of Portsmouth. I mean, just outside. And this farm, by and large, for most Jewish immigrants, was the way station. It was the place where they worked for a certain number of weeks, months, for board, and it's a place where they were taught the ropes, or at least some of the ropes, and what to do and where to go and how to find a job and what not to do and so forth. And then they would leave Charlie Gauss's farm here, and they'd come to Portsmouth. Other people would come in. Portsmouth.
Was this the family that owned the farm? Were they Jewish?
Yes.
Yeah.
They were Jewish. And I know that was typical of many immigrant groups. There would be in other words, they took care of the indoctrination to a certain large amount themselves. It wasn't a government thing as we have tried to do now. They were these people, and for labor, they got to learn a little bit of English, and they got, a few things going. But I know it was just as true with Italians as it was for Jews, as it was for Irish, and so forth. As far as their coming here, the Lawrence, I'm not sure just how accepting. I don't know. Unlike the Shapiro thing, where we have a real clear idea, they all came from one town on that side of the family. Not sure on my father's side. I know it was Russian, and I know that he had TB, and I know that but I don't know too much about that part of the thing. I have his immigration papers, and I know that he didn't serve in World War I. I'm not exactly sure why, but he may have found some way of getting out, because that's a pattern of the guys who were leaving, didn't want to be with the Cossacks in the army, and they knew they'd die. So I think, whatever reason it was, he didn't serve in the service, though he was old enough to do so. What else?
Yeah. So you grew up in Portsmouth.
Yes.
And maybe you could just give me a sort of a brief view of in the time of your growing up, the dimensions of the Jewish community at that time.
Yes.
And your role in it, your involvement in. Did you go to Hebrew school? That sort of thing?
Sure. Well, in my case, quite similar to my father's, I think, in a way, example. I lived very comfortably in both worlds, Christian and the Jewish world. I don't know, very comfortably, but I lived in both worlds. I clearly remember my good friend Eddie Tober, Jewish kid, and myself walking to grammar school each day, which meant we had to pass the St. Patrick's School, which meant we had to go through a cordon, which meant that sometimes we had to fight. But the most unique fight was one time when the cordon sort of stopped us, and somebody said something like, "The Jews don't know how to fight anyway." And I don't know how it happened exactly, but the next thing I knew, Eddie Tober and I were fist-fighting each other, surrounded by all the Irish kids. And I do remember that I did hit Eddie on the nose a couple of times. He had a very big nose. and thing finally stopped, fight, and picked up our stuff. We went on, but I'll never forget, as we were moving through, I heard one of the Irish kids say, "Well, of course, no wonder Winebaum's such a good fighter. His father gives him boxing lessons." Not true, of course, but yeah, we had to go through the cordon. But the other half of the story is that I was very taken by the Christian kids, particularly in the South End, the poorer part of town, because they were great athletes. And I would, for years as a teenager and just before, I guess, I would ride my bicycle down to the South End. I'd be alone, the only Jewish kid, and I'd play baseball, football, pick up games that we had. I would stay over at Charlie Smith's, who was the best athlete. It turned out to be the best athlete in high school, and went to Hobart on an athletic scholarship. And he would come to my house, stay over, and I think that one of the things that helped me to that end, and once again, I think this is insightful. I mean, it's anecdotal, but I think it's insightful. In the same Twilight League that I spoke of, the golfers, which my father was one of the few Jews, my father thought it was a good idea to bring me to the Twilight League. I'd be the only kid. I would not caddy for him, but I'd go around with him, and then after it was over, there'd be a great meal, 40 or 50 guys. I'd be the only kid, and I'd be there to answer any questions and to keep my mouth shut. Or, I was a child with adults, and my father, either because he felt he couldn't give me all the time that maybe he should, or maybe he was even smarter than that and knew that in order for, as he had done himself, for a kid to grow up, he's got to know how to be with adults and participate in the correct way with adults. And I thought that was just now, so much older, I think that was such a genius thing for me as an individual, but more importantly, as a Jewish person, it helped me see. I ate ham, and which I loved, which I, of course, never had at home. And I was around all the shipyard workers and the lawyers and the whole mixed bag. But I'm trying to say that Jewish identity is, if you have it the way in which I think my father had it, as I've tried to have it my whole life long, it is broad. It can be broad. And if you're able to cope with a broader scope. For example, when I was in the advertising business in New York City, the agency I was with, Young and Rubicam, was the largest in the country and the best. And they had a few Jews in management and marketing and creative, but they had no Jews in account management and management. When the new president came in, a friend, the first thing almost that he did was to ask me to be the head of Young and Rubicam's new to be opened office in Milan, in Italy. Now, there you go. You're in a Catholic country. There were a small Jewish population always in Italy, but there was one, and I was trained, lack of a better term, to cope with that situation. I never once, nor did anybody know otherwise, that I wasn't Jewish. I never did a thing like, the Secretary of Defense, turned Episcopalian, starts with W.
Wolfowitz?
No, before in Nixon.
Weinberg.
I never did a shtick like that. I was, I always, I never, but I just felt that through my father's example, he never did any training, no training. It just, I was able to work in that world, very successful. Ran office, Young and Rubicam in France after that, and so I'm just trying to put a paradox. You may not want this for your thing, but I'm not on a paradox. I'm just trying to say that it's not a question of passing. It's a question of being a human being, a whole human being, having value, maybe, and people appreciating that value. Certainly the timing at one point, 50 years ago, it probably would have been well-nigh impossible. Okay, now where are we now?
Well, I'm going to just ask because
I'm jumping around.
Well, that's fine. You're verging on something of particular interest. Do you think, having grown up in New Hampshire and living here now in Maine, do you think that there's something about New England people in particular which is particularly tolerant? Is there a particular tolerance that makes it possible for somebody like your father or yourself to be able to thrive?
Yes, I do believe, and I'll give you a couple of examples, but the kind of republicanism we had in the days of which I speak in New England with the Saltonstalls and the O'Neills and Chafees and all those people, and Margaret Smith and Muskie and all the kind of politicians we had here, were Republican or Democrat, were of the school that did not live for a status, born status alone. It was important, rightfully so, what the hell. But it wasn't, as in I think in many other parts of the country, you ain't born into it, you're nothing. Of course, the people that are born into it are kind of nothings of the first order. But I think a tradition here, much as Judge Guptill is a perfect example. I mean, he couldn't be more of the power elite than Judge Guptill. So I think there is something to say about that. Stop it just 1 second.
Yeah. To
To give you a good example of how things were in Portsmouth. Portsmouth is and was relatively unique in terms of New England towns, particularly those that were wealthy through trade, piracy, or whatever it was. A town like Newburyport, similar seaport town, was stratified as the people who lived on High Street up with the elite, and then mid-street, and then the low class were near the water. That was very stratified. Portsmouth, as a town, even though it was very, very, I wouldn't say very, it was rich, by the nature of the way the geography laid out, was never stratified. In other words, people like Dean Howells, the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, lived next door to the Shapiros in the South End. And Thomas Bailey Aldrich, famous writer, Story of a Bad Boy, lived next door to him. So everything was sort of a stone's throw, cobbler, whatever. As a matter of fact, one of the ways you can best express this uniqueness of Portsmouth, even though they had a lot of dough, and the Portsmouth furniture is some of the greatest in the country ever, and the houses too, they never had a junior league in Portsmouth. They never had that sort of a debutante kind of a ball, which every crappy little town, all around the country has, to its detriment, of course. But we never had that in Portsmouth. We always mixed. Dancing school, I went to with Miss Bragdon's dancing school. We never for a minute had any idea that these were the upper crust people and these were the lower crust. We all went to the little dancing school with the terrible dancing school. We all went, we all were bashful, and we all, but there was never any kids who had been sort of trained, and it was very, very mixed bag. So I think that Portsmouth, as a town, had a certain uniqueness that you may not find, for example, in Newburyport, which is exactly, same molasses trade, same slave trade, same kind of thing, but it just broke itself out. And, Mom did that wonderful sociological study on, Newburyport, these three streets. That's a great question. Yes, my name, Sumner, is in no way, shape, manner, or form a family name having anything to do with any dead relatives. However, we had an aunt in Boston, my father's side, who had certain ideas about New England and her family, and what they were or what they weren't. And she convinced my mother to give me this name. But more importantly, I have two first cousins who have the same name, Sumner. There are 3 Sumners in our family. It has nothing to do with Charles Sumner, has nothing to do. The name, though, she thought was very fancy Brahmin name. It turns out that when I went to college and I studied Chaucer, one of the most despicable characters in Chaucer is the summoner, who you could buy off. He'd come for your atonements, and you could say to him, look, here's some dough and whatever, and he'd say, well, you only have to do 6 rather than 60 Hail Marys or whatever it was that he was, your indulgence was. So the name, it was always an embarrassment to me. I hated the name. I always found it a heavy burden. As a matter of fact, when I went to college in California, I decided this was a great moment. My middle name is Joseph, so I introduced myself as Joseph Winebaum. And all the guys say, hey, Joe, how you doing? Great. And then the first letter came from my folks or whoever saying Sumner. And they said, Sumner, what a name. Where'd you ever get a name like? So I was Sumner thereafter to everybody. So I hated that name. I really hated it. I still hate it. But it was an idea on one of my aunts that it was a real New England Brahmin name, and we should have it.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. Now the other question. This is the bigger question, although that turns into a pretty interesting one too. Given what some of your observations about, I guess, the relative ease with which Jews can be part of the social and cultural fabric here, whether that's New England or the United States or what have you. I'm curious to. It's one of the things that I'm exploring in the book because, as I say, I'm interested in how people kind of root themselves in places and ideas about places. And so for Jews, there is always the question, well, is there a place for Jews, and is that place Israel? Mm-hmm. Or is the whole world the place where Jews belong, or particular places? And I wonder, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. But you could go anywhere with it, really.
Well,
Let me just.
Well, first off, continuing Portsmouth, when I was a kid, there was, I knew of no intermarriage. Maybe that's because I was a kid. There was some, but I knew of none. My son and his wife, 2 kids, live here in New Hampshire. They belong to the same synagogue, and 75% of all the marriages are mixed in Portsmouth. Not 50, 75%. The synagogue is flourishing. It has more kids, and it has 6 or 7 teachers. You know, formerly there was just 1. It's flourishing. My son is married to a Catholic girl. She's a Swiss. She converted. And, but the whole circumstance of identity is, evolving so fast that you have the problem that everybody is worried about, what the hell is happening to the Jews? Big problem. And one of the things that may be a little bit Pollyannish, but almost always the converted people take up the cudgels and do a better job than the born Jews. So I think in one sense, I don't worry about it quite as much. Technically, it's difficult, but I don't worry about it as much, actually, as so many of the professionals who could be right, but worry about it. Because I just see Dominique, and she's just doing great. And the kids that are, great bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, and just shut it off for a second. I'll give you a little. When Helen and I were getting married, we got married in New York at Helen's sister's place on 72nd Street. Nice apartment, just enough room for a minion and old pals, and my father thought it was a good idea to bring down the rabbi from Portsmouth to officiate at the wedding. And he met Helen, and he talked with her, and then he came out and he said, "Oh my God, we can't have this wedding. Helen's mother is Christian," because Helen had been Jewish her whole life long, as far as she's concerned. And there we were to have this wedding. And my father asked the rabbi to go into the bedroom with him and let's talk this over. So the rabbi came out with my father a little bit, and then they asked Helen to go in, and she asked her some questions, and she converted. She was converted. I mean, they call her Sarah. But anyway, shut the thing off just 1 second. So that was us, in a sense. Once again, another intermarriage. However, when Dominique and Sam, my son, were married, and Nathan, grandson, was born, and then Dominique converted after he was born, and she did the mikveh and everything. Sam then was about 7, 6. Anyway, the rabbi said to him at the time, he said, Nathan, you're not Jewish. You're going to go to Hebrew school if you want, but you have a choice. When you're 13, you can choose to be Jewish, or you don't have to. So he did, and had the bar mitzvah. And the thing that was so great about it was that, and this is a real Portsmouth story, it was in April, maybe it was May, but there's no mikveh in Portsmouth. We had gone to Portland, and the rabbi said, well, we're going to go down to the beach at Newcastle. There's another young boy who's bar mitzvah and convert, and I have a young couple intermarrying, and they're going to convert. So the three of them took their clothes off on the beach, and they went into the unbelievably cold weather. It was a lovely day, but the water was cold as could be. They baptized themselves. They dunked themselves 3 times. They came out, and there they were, converted. So you just have got to go with the flow, and you don't lose sight of the fact that you're Jewish, and you revel in it, but you don't have it hanging heavy over everything. And what could be a better conversion when you get Dominique, who wasn't Jewish, and you get Nathan, who theoretically wasn't Jewish, and you don't convert in a kind of a big synagogue, mikvah, but you go in the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, that's great. Mm-hmm. So it has to be evolving. Much as I say, I don't really think the intermarriage thing, unless you're Hasidic oriented, is as dangerous as people say. I know the numbers aren't good as one would like, but I think the spirit, the Jewishness spirit, is pretty good, pretty strong. The trouble is, in one sense, that it's gotten so endemic to the whole society that people don't realize, Christians as well as Jews, how much they have assimilated Jewish behavior, folklore, language, and so forth. So I mean, it's there, as you know. What else? When I became head of Young and Rubicam in Milan, I was in my office a couple of months after things started, and I got in the mail an official document, and it said, Mr. Winebaum, you're working for Young and Rubicam, you're making X thousands of dollars a year, family is so-and-so, you have your choice. As a government thing, you have your choice of either being your social needs being supported by money you pay to the Italian government, or by, I think, 10% that you pay to the Jewish community in Italy, in Milan. First off, I was shocked that they, one, knew me at all. Mm-hmm. Number two, that they knew exactly how much money I was earning, which was really a surprise. And so I went to our lawyers, who happened to be the lawyer Carneluti for the Vatican. Very fancy firm. And I went to Tito and I said, "What the hell is this damn thing?" And he said, "Well, Sumner, the Jews made a bargain with Mussolini in the 30s that he would keep his hands off them and he would do nothing for them in payment for keeping his hands off them, and that they would take care of all their burying and social needs and poor people and all that." And I said, "Well, hasn't that been the law changed?" He said, "No, this was in 1960 something, 62 or 3. The law hadn't yet been changed. I think it has been changed since." And but once again, there's your Jewish identity jumping up and hitting you right in the face, and you go along. I decided to go with the Jewish, give the money, 10% to the Jewish synagogue fund or whatever it was. I did it that way rather than going with the government plan.
It's startling to hear that these Mussolini laws were still
going.
We're still on, but that's also, I guess that's sort of.
But the Jews, I think,
maybe.
were more than happy at the time to let it go.
Yeah.
Well,
it's a question of survival.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, so it wasn't the best, but they sort of said, "Hey, well, until something really better comes along, we're doing okay."
Yeah.
And here's this American Jew here, as many others, he pays up.
Yeah. Huh. So did you...
Small towns, but anyway,
Yeah.
for your amusement, when I got to France, I'll skip the Italian part. In France, there were 4 or 5 very large agencies, and Young and Rubicam was the last of the. They were French agencies, but Young and Rubicam was the last international agency to start an office in Paris, in France. And much as this other thing, I got a call from Mr. Bleustein Blanchet. I knew who he was. He was the president of Publicis, which was the largest agency in France, and he was Jewish. I knew that. I knew him. I knew of him. And he asked me to come to lunch with him, and I did, and with his son-in-law, Claude Marcus. And first thing I found out that Claude Marcus had gone to Dartmouth, and number 2 that Mr. Bleustein Blanchet had great respect for my company, and he felt that Young and Rubicam, i.e. an international agency, should be represented by a Jew, should be brought into this circle of about 6 big agencies who really ran the show. One was a government agency, Havas, and there were 3 French agencies, but no J. Walter Thompson, no McCann Erickson, none of the international agencies. But because I do believe I was with a good company, and secondly, I do believe because I was Jewish, in this case, I got invited into the inner circle. Wasn't necessarily the right way to run a company, but that's the way they ran it in France. And I was very fortunate, and it helped my business and my business career enormously. And because I knew, continued my relationship with Bleustein Blanchet and Marcus all the years I was there. But it was unspoken completely unspoken. I'm drawing these conclusions,
Yeah.
and if there had been Mr. Smith, who was running Young and Rubicam in Paris, starting, he might have got the same call. They don't know.
Yeah.
No one ever said anything whatsoever on the subject.
Right.
But I do believe there was a little, lack of a better word, conspiracy there. But I keep on going over the same things. Maybe you would say, well, hell, the guy isn't really comfortable in his skin. But I'm doing it to give you the kind of insight I don't think that you get every time when you go through this thing. You get what we did in the Shapiro House. The immigrants, they came, they worked so hard, and they took in borders, and they scrimped and they saved. All that's true. My family did that. To a degree, I did that. But beyond the Shapiro House story, there is an awful lot more that needs to be told about immigrants in this country, how it really, really was to be an immigrant, and what they really, really did to get through the day. And it's like the colonial revival thing. It wasn't like that. Please. The immigrant story really wasn't like that. The Shapiro thing was good. It's good. It's good history. It's not great history. And we're starting a thing at Strawberry Bank, and I'm starting it, called the Center for the Study of Community. And we're going to dig in to all kinds of things.
Figure out how it really worked.
Yeah, how it really worked. Yeah. And then if it really worked this way, whether it was immigration, whether it was globalization, I talked a lot about piracy, you know. What can we learn from that for tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
Not just, here's what really happened. That's good. That's very good. Because we don't know that really well. I'd like to carry it